Welcome back. My name is Vern, and today we are talking about Gnostic. Now, I don't know about you, but when I came out of jw.org, when I left the religion and I seen these kinds of words, Gnostic, it was something that I wasn't really interested in, and I never really thought about it much. But as time progressed, this is like 15 months ago when I really woke up. At that point, I wouldn't look at the word Gnostic. I felt that was something kind of satanic, I guess, from how we were taught in jw.org. We're going to take a look at jw.org and see what we were taught. But the word Gnostic didn't sit well with me. But now, after doing more research, realizing that there's more to the Bible narrative than perhaps what we thought, and what's missing and what's the backstory. I'm more interested in the backstory. So it's led me to look into this word Gnostic from more of a generic term. So I went to Wikipedia, and Gnosticism is from ancient Greek, and it's having knowledge. So it's not a scary word. It's not a demonistic word. It's just a word, kind of like the word apostate. We talked about that, and the word cult. These are not scary words. They're just words. Being an apostate is nothing scary. It just means that we changed our religious or political belief. You become an apostate of that belief system. So that's what we do when we leave a religion, any of us. So Gnosticism is about knowledge, about having knowledge, and it's a collection of religious ideas and systems that come from the late 1st century AD among the Jewish and early Christian sects. So this is right at the beginning, right at the time of Christ, right within memory. People would remember all the stories. These are the first followers of Jesus, and they wrote a bunch of stories, and they called these Gnostic. So it says these various groups emphasize personal spiritual knowledge, gnosis, above the proto-Orthodox teachings and traditions and authority of the religious institutions. Remember, the religious institutions of Jesus' day, he rejected them. The scribes and the Pharisees are very much like the Catholicism. They're like Catholicism and mainstream Christianity, to me, mirrored the scribes and the Pharisees of Jesus' day. They mirrored them in cloak and dress and standing in the synagogues with their big hats, looking all pompous and proud. The Catholicism mirrored largely the Pharisaical religious system of Jesus' day, and Jesus rejected it. Jesus turned over the money tables, and therefore they had him killed. They talked Pontius Pilate into killing Jesus, which they thought they killed him. Now, there's another side to that story. We're going to talk about that a little later with Paul Wallis. So Paul Wallis, you all know Paul Wallis, so we're bringing him into the show. We're going to ask him a few questions. And this is kind of a transcript of one of his earlier videos, but we're going to ask him a few questions about what he thinks of Jesus in India. And he has a most recent video on his channel that goes into more detail. So anyways, when we talk about Gnosticism, it is not a scary thing. It's considered, it says here, consequently, Gnostics considered material existence flawed or evil and held the principles, elements of salvation to be direct knowledge of the hidden divinity. And they attained via mystical or esoteric. Now, I thought esoteric, I was wondering what that meant. And it's nothing scary either. It's just another word, and it's just talking about mystery. Scholars use to categorize a wide range of loosely related ideas and movements that developed within the Western society. And the dictionary on that says it's intended for or likely to be understood by only a small number of people with special knowledge of or interest. Esoteric. Esoteric. Esoteric is the word. So again, another word that, as ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, I don't think we should be afraid of these things. We should be willing to or interested in looking into this. So that's what I've done. Now, when we look at Jesus as a Gnostic savior, so again, Gnosticism is wisdom, knowledge. So Jesus as a knowledgeable savior, that makes sense. Gnostic, knowledge. It says Jesus is identified by some Gnostics as an embodiment of the Supreme Being who became incarnate to bring gnosis or knowledge to the earth. And while others adamantly denied that the Supreme Being came in flesh, claiming Jesus is to be merely a human who attained enlightenment through gnosis and taught his disciples to do the same. So I think that's how you say it, gnosis. So others believe Jesus was divine, although he did not have a physical body. So there was different beliefs there. So here's the development. 3 periods can be discerned in the development of Gnosticism. There's a late 1st century and early 2nd century development of Gnostic ideas, contemporaries with writings of the New Testament. And then there's the mid 2nd century to the early 3rd, the high point of the classical Gnostic teachers and their systems, who claimed that their systems represented the inner truth revealed by Jesus. And then there's the end of the 2nd century to the 4th century reaction by the Proto-Orthodox Church and condemnation as heresy and subsequent decline. So once the church established in the 4th century, 400 years after Christ, this church shows up, Constantine's in there, and they've taken this all over. Of course, they're going to make everything else hearsay. It's all kind of wicked, demonized. You demonize it all. And that's kind of how I see Jehovah's Witnesses doing it. We're going to look at JW.org here and see how they view all of this. So then during the first period, the 3 types of traditions developed. Genesis was reinterpreted in the Jewish millennials, viewing Yahweh as a jealous God who enslaved people. And freedom was to be obtained from this jealous God. And we see that, where Jesus didn't even acknowledge him and said, my father is not your father. So that's what he said to the Pharisees. He said that his God was a different God. So it goes on to say a wisdom tradition developed in which Jesus' sayings were interpreted as pointers to an esoteric wisdom. Okay, remember that word esoteric? That's the understood by a small number of people with specialized knowledge. So Jesus had this specialized knowledge, and they called that an esoteric knowledge at the time, right? Because it was new knowledge in which the soul could be divinized through identification with wisdom. And some of the Jesus sayings may have been incorporated into the Gospels to put a limit on this development. And the conflicts described at 1 Corinthians may have been inspired by a clash between this wisdom traditions and Paul's gospel of crucifixion and a rising. And a mythical story developed about the descendant of a heavenly creature to reveal the divine world as a true home of human beings. Jewish Christianity saw the Messiah, or Christ, as an eternal aspect of God's hidden nature, his spirit and truth, who revealed himself through sacred history. So the movement spread in areas controlled by the Roman Empire and Arian Goths. Arianism, it's a Christological doctrine, first attributed to Arius, a Christian presbyter from Alexandria, Egypt. So Arian theology holds that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, who was begotten by God the Father, with the difference that the Son of God did not always exist, but was begotten or made before. So that was the Arian Goths. And the Persian Empire, they were also, they had a Iranian political and cultural power. So this is kind of Iran. And it continued to develop in the Mediterranean, Middle East before and during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. But decline also set in during the 3rd century due to a growing aversion from Nicene Church and the economic and cultural deterioration of the Roman Empire. Conversion to Islam and the this other word, Albigensian Crusade, or the Cathar Crusade, was a military and ideological campaign initiated by the Pope Innocent III to eliminate um, these Catharianism, what is now southern France. So the crusade was prosecuted primarily by the French crown and promptly took on a political aspect. So that's what we've seen. A lot of these crusades happened because of religion, because of Christianity, a lot of bloodshed. So it goes on to say there was it reduced all of these crusades greatly reduced the remaining number of Gnostics throughout the Middle Ages. And though Mandean communities still existed in Iraq, Iran, and diaspora communities, Gnostic and pseudo-Gnostic ideas became influential in some philosophies of various esoteric mystical movements of the 19th and 20th centuries in Europe and North America. So there's still a lot of Gnostic groups out. There's Gnostic channels on the internet. So this is definitely a big movement, and there's a lot to it. So I just touched on a little bit of it, just the Jesus part of it, because that's what we're focusing on today. And we're going to see if Jesus has some other history that perhaps we don't know about. So we're going to now take a look at Paul Wallis, and we're going to get him on the screen and see what he says. So Paul, first of all, could you give us a little idea of a little bit of your history and what got you to this point of talking about Jesus?
Spent my younger years really as an atheist, really in reaction against my experience of institutional Christianity in my church school. And at a very young age, I just felt this Christianity was really just part of the school's apparatus for managing us and controlling us, and I wasn't very impressed with it. I started reading the Gospels, and I began to think that actually this Jesus figure was quite credible, and that his teachings were actually quite profound. The moment I realized that the credibility of institutional Christianity and the credibility of an historic Jesus were two different questions, it enabled me to respond to Jesus in a more positive way. I noticed that there was a big difference between the Jesus I was discovering in the Gospels and what I saw the church doing. I began asking questions about the church's claim to authority. The church wants to have the monopoly of information about Jesus. So what do we do with indigenous stories about Jesus from other parts of the world? Because only 6 years before, I had been in Kashmir, and I knew that in that part of the world, it's just spoken as fact. Jesus was here. Jesus was here when he was younger, and then when I got to Srinagar, there was the claim Jesus was here when he was older. And so I bring these questions back to the church. Well, what about these other stories about Jesus from other places? My mum was a member of the Women's Institute in the UK, and their national anthem as a movement is the hymn Jerusalem, based on the William Blake poem, which is a series of direct claims that Jesus was in England. And it is a very ancient tradition in the west of England, in Somerset, in Cornwall, that Jesus in his youth was in England. So I asked my teachers, well, how do these other claims about Jesus, his life and his teaching and his ministry relate to what we teach here? And they were very, very dismissive. And I couldn't understand that, because if Jesus was a real historical person, and if we believe what's in the canonical Gospels, then we've got this huge chunk missing from his life. Where was he? What was he doing? What's the explanation for where he got his great wisdom from? Why are there these very compelling connections between Eastern thought, Buddhist thought, and some of the theology of Jesus and those who wrote for Jesus? Why is it so difficult to set Jesus in a historical context and say Jesus may have had knowledge of world philosophy before he embarked on his teaching ministry. Why is it so offensive to Orthodox Christianity to say he may have been in England or France or Japan or China or India? I know why there's controversy over saying he was there after the crucifixion, but why is it controversial before? So I had these questions from the get-go. The answers I was given were part of a general pattern, the British answer to these questions taking precedence over the Indian answer. And that would shape what was in my textbooks as a boy at school. Or the Jerusalem story of Jesus taking precedence over the French stories or the English stories. It's really a pattern of the political imperial powers of the day taking priority over indigenous information. You can go to almost any country and see there's a difference between what you'll learn in school and hear on the TV and what you'll hear when you listen to the folkloric level. That's where you'll hear these other stories that say Jesus was here when he was younger, he was here when he was older, Jesus was here when he was single, Jesus was here when he had a family. There's no reason for me to feel threatened by those stories. I'm very happy to listen with an open ear to what they're saying and what information they may have that might add to my knowledge and add to my understanding of what this is all about. I find it really exciting, perpetually rediscovering Jesus, who I think is far more interesting than institutional Christianity is often presented. The moment you listen to the world of narratives surrounding him, not just the Jerusalem stories, but the Indian, English, French, Japanese, Chinese stories around the world relating to this historic figure, a more interesting picture opens up. When you start listening to the Gnostic Gospels, a more interesting picture opens up. And I find through my research, when I go back to Jesus, back to the texts and ask, have we been reading that right? I always find that a more interesting and more empowering Jesus emerges, one who shows us just how amazing this human life can be.
Now, we were talking about ascension, how Jesus ascended. We all know the Bible narrative and how it, Jesus died for all mankind, spilled blood, blah, blah, blah. Raised in 3 days. Everyone came, he was gone. He appeared to Thomas, showed holes in his hands. So we all know that narrative. So now, Paul, can you tell us some of the Gnostic narratives, please?
Over whether Jesus resurrected, as we conventionally understand it, or whether he survived the cross. And you might think, oh, well, the Gnostic Gospels might say he survived, but the canonical ones say he died, and then by a supernatural intervention of God, he came back to life. Well, it's not quite that clear cut. The Gnostic Gospels make very clear there was a question, what happened to Jesus? Did he really die on the cross? Did he survive it? What happened to him after he survived it?
And Paul, when we were talking previous, you had an illustration on Jonah. You were talking about the Jonah thing. Could you elaborate on that for the audience a bit, and where Jesus mentioned that?
I find it very interesting that when Jesus foreshadowed his own resurrection, he spoke about the sign of Jonah. No sign will be given this generation except for the sign of Jonah. And of course, Jonah didn't die. Jonah survived something that should have killed him, survived being swallowed by this fish and then spewed back up on the land. That's what Jesus is referring to. So his own image for the waking up and being again after the cross was not an image of dying and coming back from death. It was surviving something that could have killed him. So that's the Jonah reference, which is just intriguing. And then there is another resurrection in the canonical Gospels, of course, and that's the resurrection of Lazarus that Jesus achieves. That's an interesting template because Lazarus was brought back from the dead, but was still mortal and died. I mean, there were questions. John's Gospel tells us this right at the end. There were questions as to whether Lazarus had been raised immortal, whether he would die now he'd come back from the dead. But he did. apparently, because there are no stories of an immortal Lazarus wandering around. So the other resurrection in the Gospels is of somebody coming back from the dead, living a mortal life, and then dying. And if you listen to the stories from out of Japan, it's of a Jesus who was there after the crucifixion, lived a long life, and then died. Same when we go to Kashmir. The story is of Isa, healer, teacher, leader of the community of the healed, but he's mortal. He lives until he's 80 years old, and then he dies. So there's the difference between the classic resurrection and ascension story and these other stories from around the world that talk about a mortal Jesus, one who may have had a family and lived and died in Kashmir at the age of 80. It says he awoke and was again. I think it's possible that that experience was elaborated into the church doctrine of death, resurrection, and ascension. The ascension story is that his followers saw Jesus' body being taken up into the sky. What does that mean? Do you take that literally? What's a body going to do once it gets out of breathable atmosphere? There's got to be a bit more to that story, hasn't there? So either you're going to take it in a very nuts and bolts way and say, well, he must have been taken up into something to survive, or it's a metaphorical statement of Jesus transcending death. The church is actually trying to interpret what's happened, that Jesus was seen after the cross and then he wasn't seen. How do you write that story? How do you end that story? Well, the Apostle Paul does it with this long section in 1 Corinthians 15 about Jesus transcending death. And he effectively says, if Jesus' story ends with his death, then we're to be pitied more than anything. If there's no longer story, we're all wasting our time. But he uses phrases when he talks about Jesus transcending death, which are borrowed from the Mahapari Nirvana Sutra, which is all about that cycle of life I was talking about before, that transcends death, that talks about a conscious existence that proceeds, lives within this material life, survives it. And in the Mahapari Nirvana Sutra, we've got this description of the ascension of the master. And there are these phrases in it. We're familiar with Paul's version of it, where Jesus appears after the cross, first to Cephas, then to the 12, then to more than 500 on a single occasion, many of whom are still alive, though some have died. All those phrases are in the Mahapari Nirvana Sutra. Why would the Apostle Paul, if he's wanting to insist on the historicity of Jesus surviving death or being resurrected after death, why would he appeal to a Buddhist source?
Now that certainly gives a different light on things. When I think that way, it actually gives me a little bit more hope for Jesus. That there's a bit more story to Jesus. Like we only know such a small story about Jesus, but yet he's such a great man. So this is interesting. So now we were talking earlier about the Buddha and how that's intriguing. So tell us how that goes.
Many people listening to the Eastern stories about Jesus listen and say, well, this is just impossible, because Christianity has become this narrow canon of stories and this narrow orthodoxy of theologies. And there's this notion that any information outside of the institutions that are married to this narrow orthodoxy is non-information, doesn't count. Doesn't count because it comes from a different culture, really, is the message. And yet, if we remember that in the beginning, Christianity was a kaleidoscope of experiences and ideas and theologies and practices, you look at that kaleidoscope, look at the Gnostic stories, look at the non-canonical texts that didn't find their way into what became the Orthodox mainstream Bible, and many of the aspects that relate to Vedic teachings, Tantric teachings, these are there in the Gnostic texts and in the kaleidoscope that was Christianity in the beginning.
Now, on your video, Jesus in India, you were talking about the chromosomes, and you gave some indication that there's some chromosomes in the bloodline that shows that some of the tribes come from Abraham, which was quite interesting. Can you elaborate on that a bit, please?
Intriguing again because of this connection between the Christian stories and Eastern stories. It's also intriguing because in the beginning we realize it was not so cut and dried. The early words of the New Testament texts mean Jesus awoke and was again. That's a far more open story than the church is often told. And if indeed it does fit within the idea of the soul that we find in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, or the idea of consciousness that we find in Plato, Paul being a huge fan of Plato, then it's a more open story. It shows Jesus as a model of all of us, that we're all on this incredible hero's journey. Right. When I became a Christian, I was told that Jesus had emerged from the Hebrew tradition, which is from the Middle East, originating in the Fertile Crescent. The story begins really with Abraham and Sarah emerging from a Sumerian-based culture, developing their own culture. The Bible grows up from there. Who were Abraham and Sarah? Where were they really from? Where was their culture from that it could be differentiated from ancient Sumerian-based cultures?
And then you talk about India and Abraham, you have many nations, and how that all fits in. Can you help us out there a bit, Paul?
Stories of Brahma to India. Make the journey to the Vedic traditions, and you will hear the stories of Brahma and Saraswati, the progenitors of the many nations. And as soon as you hear that, you should raise an eyebrow and say, I think I know those names. Brahma, Saraswati, progenitor of the many nations. Go to the Hebrew stories and you have Abraham and Sarah, the progenitors of, and we usually say of many nations, Abraham the father of many nations. What if it's the father of the many nations? What if Abraham and Sarah is really a very ancient primordial story of human beginnings? We could be looking at the same story. The Hebrew story could be a part of the Vedic stories of Brahma and Saraswati. And maybe we should think again, therefore, about what we think the Hebrew tradition is and where it comes from and where those tribes came from. I think we do our ancestors a discredit to think that everyone was locked in their tiny little region of the planet. I think the movement of human beings on planet Earth has always been much more fluid than we tend to give credit for. Maybe the antiquity of the Vedic traditions ought to command a bit more respect around the world, especially when we see that the Hebrew tradition may indeed be an offshoot of that ancient tradition. And I would suggest the names of Abraham and Sarah and the stories that emerge of them would support that idea.
Now, the part that I like the best is the three wise men. And if we remember the three wise men story, the three wise men come, Jesus was born, there was a light that indicated where Jesus was. It was a star, apparently. And there's discrepancies on these things, but for the most part, they're there. Jehovah's Witnesses don't really talk about them that much, and they really stay away from it. We think of the three wise men, the magi. Even that word, the magi, there's some mystical, magical power there. Where do they come from? How do they fit in? And where did Jesus go? Remember, he had to leave because when he was born, because King Herod wanted to kill him. So they left. They went to Egypt or something. And tell us a little bit more about what you have discovered, Paul.
Of the Epiphany in Orthodox Christianity is really intriguing because it's a story that stands on its own with a lot of mystery around it. Who were these wise men who've come from the East to honor Jesus, what are they honoring him for? Who do they think he is? If they're not believers in the Jewish Messiah, who are they honoring him as? In the Buddhist tradition, an anointed baby, one known in advance to be a great teacher and philosopher, is called a bodhisattva, a reincarnation of the spirit and consciousness of the Buddha. I think a lot of Christians would be horrified by the idea that Jesus could be a reincarnation of Buddha. Many people would hear that and say, well, that's blasphemous. Jesus is the Son of God, the unique incarnation of God. He's not a reincarnation of somebody else. But the idea that Jesus might be a reincarnation of somebody else is in the Gospels, and I mean the canonical Gospels. Because there's a moment when Jesus asks his followers, who do people say I am? And they say, well, some think that you are a reincarnation of Elijah or one of the other prophets. Now, I'll pause there because, of course, we immediately think, oh, yes, they mean a reincarnation of Elijah or one of the other Old Testament prophets. But if we're setting the Hebrew tradition in Vedic tradition, could be another prophet, could be Buddha. Reincarnation of a great figure in the form of Jesus was something people were thinking about him in the Gospels, so we shouldn't be all shock and horror when we hear it suggested today. The notion of reincarnation was clearly part of the thought world that produced the canonical Gospels and the Gnostic Gospels and literature beyond. The worldview that we find in the Gnostic Gospels bears a lot of notes, and the same with the canonical Gospels, bears a lot of notes that we can find in Eastern thought. So, for instance, let's think about this timeline for Jesus as a person, as a being, as an entity. If you go to the Gospel of John, the Gospel of John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. And then the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glories, one full of grace and truth. And then at the end of John's Gospel, you hear Jesus speaking to the source, whom he addresses as Father, and he says, Father, now I'm about to return to you, back to the glory we enjoyed before the foundation of the world. And so you've got this cycle where Jesus exists before this material life and after it. Now, 500 years before, Plato was suggesting that's the timeline of all of us, that we exist as conscious beings, then we have a material experience, and then we survive it. Early church fathers were open to it at the very least. If you listen to Origen and Clement of Alexandria in particular, they have that notion that that's true not just of Jesus, it's true of all of us. And they put forward the idea that we might have other lives after this one, on this planet, on another planet, in some other dimension. And when they get into that kind of language, and remember, I'm talking about early Christianity here, that kind of language sits very comfortably in the thought family of the Eastern world. So you begin to see that the idea of reincarnation of Buddha, is not as foreign to primitive Christianity as you might first think. And when Jesus starts doing things like multiplying food and walking on water, things Buddha did, and when you read stories in the Gospels where people's names and place names appear in the sutras and in the Vedas, then you have to raise an eyebrow and realize we're looking at a great family of narratives and world thought. The church for 2,000 years has wanted to present Christianity if it's unique and in a bubble, bearing no relation to international thought or any information any other culture would ever have received or understood, and it's simply not the case. The earliest gospel of the canonical ones, Mark, makes no mention of the resurrection and ascension story. Many scholars believe that Mark and Thomas represent the earliest documentary sources that attest to Jesus. Thomas, again, absent of the commonly understood themes of resurrection and ascension. Q is the same. It's not part of the Q sayings. So the primitive versions of Christianity don't have this long pericope about death, resurrection, and ascension. The Gospels that do, Matthew, Luke, and John, all talk about Joseph of Arimathea and him having a powerful place in the society of the day, powerful enough that he could go to the Roman governor and say, you better take those bodies down now. I know they've only been on there for 6 hours, but we've got a festival coming. You take them down now. I'm taking Jesus's body. I'll be looking after it. And he's listened to. And then he turns up at the crucifixion site. I'm having that body. And he's given the body. So that shows you how much clout Joseph had. Crucifixion was a very cruel and torturous way of execution because it took so long. It would take between 24 hours and 6 days for most people to die of dehydration and asphyxiation on the cross. Jesus, according to the canonical Gospels, was only there for 6 hours. And then Joseph of Arimathea, after Jesus has received some substance that's knocked him out, says, I'm having that body. And you don't need to break his legs, thank you very much, and takes the body. What's going on here? We've got Joseph of Arimathea. Nicodemus is on the Jewish ruling council, and then this question of how have they got so much clout with Pontius Pilate that they can come to this arrangement. The 2nd century Gospel of Peter adds to our information about Joseph of Arimathea. The canonical Gospels describe Joseph of Arimathea as an influential Jewish leader, a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. Early narratives, indigenous to England, report that he was an international merchant with interests in British tin, a major commodity of that time. The Gospel of Peter claims that Joseph of Arimathea was not only close to the family of Jesus, and possibly was Jesus' uncle, but that he also had a strong friendship with Pontius Pilate. Could that be why Joseph of Arimathea was able to put a stop to the crucifixion of Jesus after only 6 hours and demand his body from the authorities? Furthermore, Pilate's wife had warned him not to be responsible for the life and death of Jesus. With his wife in one ear and Joseph of Arimathea in the other, does that explain why the Roman governor took Jesus down from the cross after only 6 hours instead of the days on end that was usually required? In the Gnostic Gospels, which hold a more diverse record of the ideas surrounding Jesus' life before and after the cross, another significant figure emerges: Mary Magdalene. Who was Mary Magdalene? According to the Gospel of Luke, Mary was a woman of wealth, part of a cohort of powerful women, which included Joanna, the wife of the prime minister or chancellor to Herod the Tetrarch. These women, says Luke, were a vital part of Jesus' entourage. It was they, he says, who financed Jesus' public ministry. The Gnostic Gospel of Philip describes Mary Magdalene as the tower, the teacher, the closest of Jesus' inner circle, Jesus' companion, the one he would kiss on the lips.
And I found it interesting when you talked about Jesus' family. Like Jesus had a family, he was married, he had a child, but not, of course, in Jerusalem. It was when he left, So that's quite interesting. If you could elaborate on that.
Once again, if you want to find an overlap between the Eastern stories of Jesus and early Christianity, you go to the Gnostic texts. In the Gnostic texts, Mary Magdalene is given a very different place to the one we find in the canonical Gospels. Mary Magdalene is Mary the tower, Mary the teacher. Mary and Jesus are the teachers. and there's this peer-to-peer presentation. When you listen to the indigenous stories of Jesus that come out of France, you will hear Mary Magdalene mentioned there as well. Stories that Jesus was there after the crucifixion with Mary Magdalene and their family. And what's intriguing about that is that tradition about Jesus is very connected with the history of the Cathars. A better human society in the Languedoc through application of ancient wisdom rooted in Gnostic texts and indigenous traditions that spoke of Jesus and his family. And where this connects with the Eastern stories is that the Cathars' whole lifestyle and belief was built around reconnecting us with our light body. Wait a minute, where else have we heard that? We're talking about Tibetan Tantric practice.
Now, tell us more, Paul, about Jesus' crucifixion. And I found it very interesting because we all know the story that Jesus died on the stake. You know, if we're a Jehovah's Witness, we call it a stake. It was a cross. And we think he died. But I didn't know that the average criminal was hung on the cross for 24 hours to 6 days to kill him, and they'd break his legs. And here, Jesus was let off in 6 hours. Why? Was he dead? I found that one of the most intriguing parts of this whole discussion. So, Paul, tell us more about that, please.
Could it be that Jesus and his early followers were part of a more international and educated demographic than the Church is generally portrayed? The canonical Gospel account appears to emphasize that Jesus had indeed died on the cross when a spear pierced his side and blood and clear fluid flowed from the open wound. Is this phrase in the canonical Gospel clinching proof that Jesus really did die? We have to ask, how closely are we going to read the text? Are we willing to accept that the texts may have been written to explain something that had happened, to reflect on something that had happened? Is it possible that there are elements in here that are historic and elements that are not? Is that possible? Or if we read it really, really closely and say, well, he was speared and there was clear fluid and there was blood that came out, what does that mean? There is the hint that Jesus' survival of the cross was not an accident, that it was carefully orchestrated, that the timing of the crucifixions had been done so the bodies could come down early, that the substance Jesus was given to drink was there to induce a near-death experience. Well, if you can accept that, can you accept there might have been other elements to the story there to make him look dead? If Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus are all involved in a plot to rescue Jesus and to make him appear dead, well, is it possible the spear story fits into that? Some will say this is impossible because they want to read the text in a fundamentalist way, where everything said has to relate to something real that happened. As soon as you allow there's another way of reading the texts, as soon as you allow that maybe the early church had to write an end to the story of Jesus' ministry in Judea and Jerusalem, well, other possibilities emerge.
Well, there you go, folks. There's Paul Wallis. So he covered a few of my questions. I hope he covered a few of yours. And when it comes to Gnostic and esoteric, these are not scary words. I wanted to look at JW.org and show you what they say. Now we're just going to pull it up here, and I'm going to type it in, Gnostic, and see what comes up. So I found that 2 articles came up. This was just the Gospel of Judas, but the last one was the Awake of 1985. And then there was an awake of 1989 snuffing out gospel light, and 1990 against knowledge, falsely so-called Gnosticism, an apostate form of Christianity. And the Apostle Paul warned Timothy to turn away from such falsely called knowledge. So it's interesting, the Watchtower does not like Gnosticism, and they view it as something that's polluted the faith. And so they like to hang on to the canon, the Bible canon that was created about the time of Constantine, about 400, and the Catholics took this and made a hierarchy religion that was very much incorporated the Jewish system and the whole Bible. But when we follow Jesus, we do get a different story, and I find that intriguing. So thanks again, folks, for joining me today, and catch you next time. Till then, keep living your life with love. Bye for now.